Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, everybody, for being here. There are a lot of touch points with the previous call, and people often ask me what about, climate change versus financial regulation. And there are some interesting points. In fact, shortly after I wrote the book, I met Naomi Oreskes, who wrote the book Merchants of Doubt, which is very much about disinformation, about climate change. And we were comparing notes. Now, I come from the dismal science of economics and represent the social sciences, so it's not quite the kind of science that we were discussing just now. And in fact, one of the differences is that academics are also part of the problem here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that towards the end. So, Disinformation in Finance, the book is a lot about economics. I'm going to do very little economics except for the incentives. And in fact, the epigraph of our chapter 8 is precisely this Upton Sinclair. You can't teach a man something if his salary depends on not understanding it. So that gets into this thing. So, financial crisis was after a career of, a couple of decades in the bubble of finance, awoken me to the fact that I was making a few bad assumptions. And as I dug into it, and as I engaged with some of my colleagues, and many of them eventually just shrugged off and moved on, I couldn't quite let go of it because there was just a lot to uncover. So there were bailouts, and there was a real, even of AIG and other companies, like that was not supposed to happen in the kinds of how wonderful finance is that I was starting my finance courses with. And so what was going on? Well, Alan wanted to use the word systemic risk, so let me just explain the term as sort of was exemplified by the fact that there were all these dominoes and panics. And basically, systemic risk means that, a lot of things happen at the same time. Either there's a chain through contractual relations or through inferences that, if Lehman fails, then some other investment bank will fail, et cetera, people panicking, people running, et cetera. And these chains then become, and continue to this day, to be a sort of pretext and an excuse for bailouts. And so the magic word systemic means that we'll, bail out SVB and, Credit Suisse and everybody, because God forbid, systemic risk, Lehman moment, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a serious harm to the financial crisis. And multiple books have said that it changed the world, it changed the politics. It definitely did change the politics. And a lot of the books about the democratic declines are kind of putting the financial crisis as a point of time in which people lost trust, people became angry, polarization increased, et cetera, et cetera. And at the heart of the financial crisis, as well as what followed, is disinformation. So for me, the experience was Alice in Wonderland falling in a rabbit hole. Curiouser and curiouser. I started looking at it, and I just didn't know what was wrong. Was I not understanding something? Did I fall into some strange island? That's what banking is like for a finance academic, governance academic like myself. So Thomas Jefferson said people need to be informed, and then you can have a democracy, when he founded the University of Virginia. Well, what I discovered is disinformation means that people are not informed, that people are persistently ill-informed, and that disinformation, what I call the corruption of knowledge, is sort of, when I became familiar with this important work here, I already had this term called corruption of knowledge, which also meant sort of hints at corruption, which Alan talked about. And so the public remains informed, the politicians can get talked into all kinds of things or are willfully blind. There are all kinds of terms associated with it. And this is what enables these situations exist, also climate debates in somewhat similar ways. So the narratives about the crisis inform policy. Some would say the crisis was like a natural disaster, send the ambulances, it couldn't have been foreseen, 100-year flood, etc. If you have that narrative, then you just want to save the system. the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission was able to subpoena even Jamie Dimon to come in before them, and he said to them that he just told his daughter that financial crisis is just stuff that happens every few years. And this is similar to these narratives of financial crisis just being some random event, act of nature, to which the response would be not to try to prevent it, but to try to send the ambulances when it happens. In banking, and especially in academic banking, they love talking about the plumbing. They call it liquidity. It's always about something about liquidity. And kind of words that people don't always understand. Some panics and sudden, on a clear blue day, everybody decided to take their money out of the banks, and we're going to therefore, calm everybody down by, bailing out, etc. The system that we have in finance now, and I'm not going to talk too much about the economics, but just a few visuals, is very complicated. Okay, it's very layered, it's very opaque, it's very fragile. This was a graph in the New York, this one was from the New York Fed, and you can't even see what's there, and it's almost the point. But the point of this one was that around this whole system, they had all these bailout windows. Come to the nearest window to get support from the Fed, the Federal Reserve. This is from the IMF, and it has a few jargony labels on some of these institutions in the middle. The shadow banking system is sort of in the middle. So the system from the people who actually live in the real world or, either invest their money or use the money, in between is lots slushing around, lots and lots of institutions. And one of the operational terms there is zombie or insolvent institutions. Those are institutions that live on the edge of insolvency or failures. They basically live on debt. And whether they actually could have paid their debt in a given moment, whether they're underwater or insolvent, is hard to tell, because as long as they don't default, you may not see it. And this is very, very pervasive in banking, because there are certain symptoms associated with financial distress and insolvency. I'm an economist in corporate finance, so I'm not going to elaborate on that right now. But just to say, in banking, you see the symptoms all the time. So if I had the stethoscope and I would look at those institutions, I would say you're behaving like something's very wrong with you, a very unhealthy one. How do you even live? Nobody lives like that in the real world. Oh, they don't live in the real world. They live in a coddled world supported by a lot of institutions around them. This is about the opacity. Ellen and I are both from business school, accounting, finance, and this is about financial statements. So financial statements is where some of the misleading stuff comes in, and we have an auditing expert in the room. And so, there are accounting rules, and there is the auditor that are supposed to monitor them, and that's a whole can of worms right there. Don't worry, I'm doing it by generally accepted accounting standards, GAAP, that's the accounting standards in the US. Michael Lewis had a correct appreciation of the problems in the epilogue of his book, The Big Short. The same Adam McKay made a movie called The Big Short. His ending was a little bit different, like why nobody went to jail, but at the end of the book, Michael Lewis reflects back on the reckless culture that he described in Liar's Poker way back in the 80s when he started his career. And he is saying the moment of time in which the people whose money was put at risk and the risk that was taken with the money became kind of, they didn't know, was when they moved from partnerships to corporations. Back in Solomon Brothers, et cetera, et cetera. So it basically became other people's money. The other people didn't know what you did with their money, and that sort of is this thing. In 2010, my involvement started with this little manifesto that characterizes 3 ways of disinformation: fallacies, false statements, irrelevant facts, meaning true but irrelevant to the discussion, or myths. Myths is the sort of most insidious, because it's not logically incorrect, it's just based on really ridiculous assumption that, Michael said, not on our planet, that may exist in some galaxy someplace, but not in the real world that we occupy. So these are fantastical dynamic general equilibrium models that would be produced in various macro finance, macro banking models, and and even in microeconomic models of banking to reverse engineer what we see as good or somehow the right thing. So we were sort of putting this out, four of us. And there were, I mean, I'm not going to really go through this. They were just in the standard speech I gave and in various slide decks that you can find. They'll say things in the newspaper to explain what some debate is about this word capital, and completely confusing what it's even about. So the starting point of the debate is just that we're talking about some rainy day fund, some money in the reserve, and that's not even the discussion we're talking about. And so they're just like false statements out there. And the false statements are very useful for lobbyists, because the lobbyists are saying, look, you're preventing us from helping the economy grow, from making loans, which is nonsense. And so there's going to be a bunch of terms for disinformation that I will introduce. This same playbook the lobbyists get, and they will say these kinds of things that scare the politician or resonate with the public, that, oh, we're preventing the banks, these regulations are going to stop the banks from making you with the loan, etc. And again, this is just nonsense. But it goes all the way to the textbooks. This was really my first moment where I knew something was really, really wrong, because Mishkin was a Federal Reserve governor, professor at Columbia University, and his textbooks to this day have false statements in them. False statements. We have a whole chapter in the book taking down that. And it's still there. It's still there to today. False statements in the banking textbooks. So this goes deep into what we teach in banking. One entry into the debate in fall, right after we published that little manifesto, was I collected 20 academics, big shots, Nobel laureates, different parts of the aisle, to sign a letter when they were signing an agreement called Basel III. And we managed to get it into Financial Times as an open letter to G20 finance ministers that were gathering in Seoul in fall 2010. Somehow, in the last minute, after the Financial Times was sitting through it in November of 2010, we were told that it's going to be in the letter section, not in the op-ed pages. And then it became sort of a letter to Sir instead of a letter to the G20. And the next day, there was an op-ed from the Citigroup CEO, who I think, learned about our letter sitting in FD and then injected that. Financial Times was mentioned, and I know a lot about Financial Times, and I was there, and they do some great investigative reporting, and they've done well. But they also kind of have that, got a balance. But in particular, a higher up in Financial Times said to me, oh yeah, I remember the story, but you know that when a bank CEO submits an op-ed, we have to publish it. So there you have it. Right there, the politics of an editorial, an op-ed pages in a major neutral newspaper that is the most sophisticated newspaper about finance. And I have a lot of good things to say about FT, but this was a real, awakening for me about what I was doing. And this is related to this is a very recent piece about coverage in the media of what Jamie Dimon said yesterday. Sometimes he says okay things, but in general, what Elon Musk said, what Sam Altman said, lazy reporting, no challenge, just what did the CEO say, like what did the head of state say. So who gets quoted? Not Michael Mann. Sometimes we are, I'm usually not. If I say something, that's not news. I mean, I can try to get in the op-ed pages, but it's part of how communication happens. So this is the book, and I'm giving you two blurbs here that are focusing on disinformation. Ken Arrow was saying at the time, no longer with us, saying that this book stands in opposition, that it has the right insight, and it stands in opposition to the self-interested forces of obscurity. In other words, the people who want to obscure the truth from you. And Jean Fama, Nobel laureate, said the book should be studied by policymakers so they don't get duped by false claims in the future. So everybody recognized that the lies were winning, the nonsense were winning, which was really very sobering, very upsetting to somebody like me, because I thought truth matters in policy of this sort. The final paragraph in the 2013 edition of the book, we have a new one, was that we can have a system, but we need political will. So what does it take to have political will? Well, unfortunately, in the ensuing years after that, despite my getting my voice a little bit more out there, amplified and going to Davos with Naomi Oretsky and all these kinds of things. This is, by the way, the book review by Martin Wolf, who said what we basically explained, banks are only special in what they get away with, And then he says the reason this is not more widely accepted is, and he gives it in two pieces, bankers are so influential, so this is about the discourse, and the economics so poorly understood. And then he says, read this book, then you'll understand the economics. So we did what we could to explain the economics. We couldn't have done it on the op-ed pages or behind the scenes because they just wouldn't listen. Now, would they listen if we write it in a book? You know, it's boring, okay? So it's not stories, so we can only get so far. After the book was published, I became aware that Paul Volcker told the senator, and this is in a book about lobbying called Why Wall Street Always Wins, told Senator Ted Kaufman, who was in the Senate for only 2 years and didn't need money to get reelected because he wasn't running for reelection, and therefore was a little more shielded from the money in politics, that they always threaten that growth and credit will suffer. That's like the parallel of the tech industry saying innovation will suffer. It's all bullshit. So bullshit is a term I will use, and I have quoted him even in Davos when given 5 minutes, saying, okay, give me more time, I'll explain the bullshit, but it's bullshit. Ben Bernanke was my colleague, he's an academic Nobel laureate, but all he wanted to hear was liquidity narrative, nothing about regulation. And he wrote a book called The Courage to Act about the heroism of the people in the bunker who saved the system from the Great Depression and all of that. So saying, look at me, I saved. And I just couldn't stop it. This was the time that I was beginning to withdraw from this debate after 5 years of nonstop lobbying, because there was really nothing more to do in 2015-16. And I wrote this op-ed, where is the courage to act on the bank, saying, yeah, he had the courage to save everybody. He didn't have the courage to stop a dividend, to regulate against what the banks wanted to do before or since the crisis, and wouldn't even engage. And he's somebody who, you know, tried to hire me to Princeton when he was there. So he knows we know what we're talking about. He just doesn't want to hear it. And this is Ben Bernanke. We were crazy enough to write another edition to this book in 2024, and basically got fat. So we ended up adding 200-page, although half of the book is in notes. So this is written in multiple levels. The last part that we added is called Undermining Democracy and the Rule of Law. And this one was more on disinformation and more about law. So there's more about central banks, some stuff we did and updated what happened in the decade since, and we had to revise it to take into account the March 2023 crisis that we were about to warn would happen and actually happened just before we submitted the book. Unfortunately, this parade of nonsense continues. And in the last count, about 2 years ago by now, there were 44 distinct flawed claims that we could quickly try to debunk, because you could say the emperor is naked, but the emperor keeps marching down the street and creating a little variation on what they're going to say. Now, it takes a village to maintain this system. This is taken out of, it takes a village if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse a child, was from the movie Spotlight, which came out together with The Big Short in 2015. And basically takes a village, meaning all the enablers of a system, the private sector, people who just participate in this and have work to do within this system, maintaining it, and then the people meant to be getting the system to work better, the regulators, central bankers, media politicians, and others, including academics. So the end of the 2024 edition speaks to power, speaks to democracy, and speaks to disinformation too. Democracy and the rule of law require that people have equal access, and then you have the power to change the narratives. To this day, you have hearings before Congress in which by now the chair of the banking committee says false things to explain to the public what this is about. Same old things that we pointed out. I wrote in 2024, nonsense and bad rules persist. This is just the situation, 14 years later. I can't seem to change it. On innovations, again, Paul Volcker said ATM was the best innovation. We had a lot of innovations, and so Ellen wanted me to talk about crypto, so I'm going to quickly mention two things that are playing out as we speak right now. So innovation in finance is usually inventing a new word or, creating a new variation of something that will not fit into the previous regulation or whatever. These new rules will change the way we get around them. So here you have Kevin Warsh, now nominated to the Fed, saying that we don't know what's going on in the banks, too opaque. This is Paul Singer on a panel with me in Davos saying, still we don't know what's going on, the statement's obscure, et cetera, and that there's still off-balance sheet more than before the crisis. So private equity is one of these shadow institutions that kind of do some things like the banks, but not quite. And so, but it's kind of in that big picture that I showed you. It's this whole interconnectedness. So right now, this is happening. They are stopping people from taking money out. There's an op-ed yesterday in the New York Times. It's beginning to look like a slow run, et cetera, et cetera. So there's stuff lurking there that's not looking so good, including private credit. And then we come to crypto. So in a sort of half tongue-in-cheek, the Economist was like, oh, it's the promised land. It's paradise, greedy intermediaries will know we don't trust the banks, we hate the banks. They'll say, come to us, trustless but trustworthy, and all kinds of language like that about democratizing decentralized finance, fancy terms. So again, a lot of it is like in the marketing language that things sound so good. Here's a skeptic saying, you waste all these resources and you're left with people you trust even less than you trust the other people. And there's another skeptic in a testimony before a House committee saying that, specific to disinformation, that the crypto industry is choosing political narratives, which is a story to get to, and that's because they don't have actually any useful thing to do. He's advocating we just ban Bitcoin entirely, et cetera, like China did, actually. And right now we have stable coins, which are supposed to be like money market funds, like dollars and all of that. And they are, here you have a 2018 paper saying, oh, Tether, tell you this is just like a dollar, but what if it's not? They have no auditing, no nothing. And then the other one, Bitnifex or whatever, also we don't know. And so they make promises, they may not survive. And then we got into total fraud and total corruption, pump and dump Trump meme coin that collapses. And then we came to the media. So I'm converging on the fact that, so this is Pulitzer saying we need to expose the truth and then we will clear it out. So this is the optimistic view of media, but what do we have today? And Michael touched on that. Here's an investigation by the New York Times about crypto-related corruption by Trump and the Witkoff family. The parents are doing one thing, the kids are doing, world financial liberty financials, and in the Wall Street Journal story, they tell you how they cheat their investors by taking money directly out of these companies. So, a few books on media. Amusing Ourselves to Death was written in 1985. It's a book about communication, which we mentioned in our book, basically complaining about, quaint cable television and sound bites and things like that. That's before media, before internet, before mobile internet, before social media already. And it was 1985, Postman republished in 2005. There's a book called On Bullshit, which says that bullshit is distinct from lies because you don't even need any anchoring in truth. You just say stuff. Okay, so you're not lying because you don't have the truth. And I'm introducing yet another term coined by some historians at Stanford called agnotology. And this is not much about what people say, but about what people try to hide from you. So it's all about non-disclosure agreements and anti-whistleblowers and all of those things, and the study of ignorance. In other words, why don't we know certain things? Who is it that doesn't want us to know, that doesn't want us to understand? In the book right now, and this is, I'm just converging, we end the book by a quote from a German economist who is talking about brutal ways to get power. And he's specifically mentioning narrative power, saying that, there are the power struggles in the economy, and he was arguing against cartel worship in Germany back in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s. And he's saying, the people are going to tell you they're all for the public good, but that's why academics need to be skeptical, he says. Unfortunately, they're not skeptical enough. And this is somebody talking in the shadow of a Nazi regime in 1940 daring to kind of speak in truth about that. What do we do? Well, I'm trying to speak up about what I see, including business education, through all kinds of articles and things about academia and things about blind spots in economics and all of that. I have an initiative called Corporation Society Initiative that will talk about social media and other things like that. I run a program, Capitalism and Democracy, but as Ellen hinted, it's much harder to get funding for these kinds of things when the donors always want to feel good. And so the bottom line is the corruption of knowledge, or what's called disinformation in any form, is a source of power. Definitely in the part of the world that I know about the most, it is why we are here with a bad financial system, reckless financial system. And it's undermining democracy. What's called transdisciplinary research, as a term I learned from my Dean Sarah Sewell, which is not just interdisciplinary, but also involves non-academics, is what we need to do in broad education. And congratulations to Ellen and to all of you and all the work that you do on this subject. Thank you.
So we do have time for questions. Raise your hand, the mics will float around. We have some in the front here.
Coming to you, right here.
Gus, here you go.
Thank you for the illuminating lecture about actually debunking narratives shaping and impacting policies with narrative takes. So my question is, today with new technologies, all of that information impacts, influences, it can be shaped proactively, but also in advance. Does it open new risks, like, for example, shaping the developments or evolution of events even before they are widely known? So trying to enforce some kind of view before events and understanding of the consequences actually sinks in. What may be the consequences, including the worst case?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you're referring to prediction markets, but that's a place where a lot of, the notion that we need more and more markets for all contingent claims. I think even Ken Arrow was disillusioned with this idea and thought that, markets in, naked credit default swaps was maybe not helpful to the world. Yeah, I mean, the problem is that we live in the world of social media and, very little tidbits. So I don't know how you can, obviously there are a lot of information strategies to kind of try to shape the way people would view different products or different types of innovations and think they somehow solve problems. It's just that it's possible to lie a lot in the guise of, free commercial speech. And so I don't know, the worst thing is, of course, we, amuse ourselves to death, as Postman says, we get confused, and then we go willingly. So it's not about 1984 Minister of Truth, it's more about Brave New World, we get too confused and not know what we're supposed to be doing.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Joachim von Braun, Bonn University. I study food systems and food markets. The financial crisis of 2007-09 was not coincident with the food crisis. Massive capital moved into commodity markets, especially the wheat and the soybean markets. The consequences were food riots in more than 60 countries because prices spiked. And we now know that thousands of children died because of the price hike. That types of research takes a lot of time, unfortunately. Now, the commodity markets were briefly regulated by the Obama administration. And then, coming to a topic of our conference, the first Trump administration backpedaled on that. So my suggestion is we really need to look beyond the financial markets. We have to look at the interlinkages with the commodity markets, because that's where the suffering of the poor really is, who have no voice and who are easily brushed aside by the disinformation actors in the financial system.
Yes, no, I agree with that. I think that seeing the connection between the financial system, which seems to be sort of there and somehow not physically connected to the rest of the world, and the real world in which people live and, you know, need commodities and other things to survive, is not well understood enough to see the connection.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk. And especially following Michael Mann's talk about climate change, the thing that struck me most was, you know, you were showing all of these, like the Financial Times, with the opinion from the CEO, and similar, obviously we see this in climate change. We also see it from like the tobacco industry,
Sure.
pharmaceutical industry, and so forth. But in the public mind, I think financial industry actors, bankers, people see those articles and they think, oh, well, this is an expert, right, from the industry.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas if it was the CEO of Exxon, they would see that as not credible in a way that I don't think they do when it's Citibank. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit on the difference there, because I think it's actually, it's not because we don't feel the harms as directly, we do. And we also have publicized this greatly, right? Like, the financial crisis was talked about so much, everybody knows the harms.
Yeah.
So why is that such a difficult thing to get across, and what do we do? Thank you.
It's such a great question, because, you know, in the beginning it was like, okay, well, what is going on here? You know, the harm was so clear. Why is it hard to change? We're saying such easy things to understand, and, you know, here we can have solutions right in front of us. I was using the term financial literacy at some point because I thought, okay, it's just that people don't understand, you know, some basic stuff, and we need to understand them. So there's no prerequisites for, you know, say reading my book takes you from the mortgage up to corporations and banks and central banks and all that. And I was told that the term financial literacy was itself overtaken by the banking sector. I was surprised to hear that, but here's what they do. They are starting early. They would go to schools and offer them, you know, amounts of money to sort of give financial literacy to the kids. And of course, there's a banner of the donor bank, and the subliminal message is, you know, trust us or like us because we're good people, and here we're going to teach you how to save or how to start a bank account or something like that. So they start early on building the concept that you can trust them, you can trust the bankers. So I think it's very sort of, they find ways to ingrain in people that, you know, they understand that the fossil fuel industry produces fossil fuels, so they could see, if they understand that fossil fuels are harmful, that these people have a self-interest. But the bankers always use these techniques, like I said, that are very subtle to kind of say, oh, I want to give you this loan, but this regulator is not allowing me or something, which is nonsense. But there's no regulation out there that prevents them from making loans. They have plenty of money. They just took a dividend, for example. They could have made a loan with that.
Thank you very much for that really, really instructive presentation. My name is David. I work for Stiftung Mercator, that is a German philanthropic foundation. I wanted to ask you about systemic risk and maybe the opaque auditing system also around banks. How worried are you, in a way, that the European Union has imported or has taken some inspiration from banking regulation when approaching platform regulation and tech regulation, importing the concept of systemic risks and also establishing a system of auditing companies, auditing platforms and so on? And what lessons should we take for that new regulatory regime?
Yeah, so if you talk about auditing specifically, obviously Germany had its big moment with Wirecard and the big audit failure over there in their fintech. If you talk about platforms, so this is fintech because Germany really wanted to have its own fintech in Wirecard, even though it was really a fraudulent organization from the start. But it took many, many years, and being included in the DAX 30 for this company to collapse in 2020. If you talk about platforms and tech, I yield to other people here, like Alexander Geese, et cetera, about specific regulation there in terms of auditing, because what are we looking for in the platforms? Are we looking for some kind of audit of the algorithm or the output of the algorithms? Like, you know, I once had a programmer of these algorithms telling us that looking at the algorithm won't tell you quite how it works, but you might want to look at the output, you know, of what people actually read as a result of the algorithm, so you can sort of see the impact at least of it, and possibly, you know, regulate the way they curate the content. If not, if you can't sort of forbid certain speech, if that's no, which it is in the US.